Hi everyone, the name is Nat and welcome to Exceptional Individuals Thursday webinars. Each week we do enlightening webinars on subjects related to neurodiversity and how our minds work. We are taking a deep dive down visual dyslexia, visual processing disorder, and Irlen syndrome. All of these sound like they're the exact same thing with just a new coat of paint, but there are differences, and those differences can massively impact how we might support ourselves. Dyslexia is used as a big old blanket term for struggling with reading, but there's lots of different reasons why you may be struggling with reading. Understanding those reasons can help you find better coping strategies. This is something which I didn't know not even that long ago. We are predominantly going to be focusing on dyslexia as our kind of key neurodivergence. But as we're going to be saying again and again, we're not actually talking about dyslexia today. Here's a picture of me to say I know stuff, almost. Now, this is a little bit of a lie. I don't actually have a master's in neuroscience. I will in a week. This Monday is my absolute deadline, and then I can chill and relax. Our last webinar we did was on maths learning disabilities. And a similar approach, really. When you think of maths disabilities, you think of dyscalculia. Actually, dyscalculia is just one particular way that your brain might process mathematical equations and understandings. Do check it out if you want to understand what are all the differences. What's difference from struggling with maths, another one we talked about is hypercalculia. Essentially, it's people who are amazing at maths, but may struggle with independent living. Really interesting how it's different from Savant syndrome. Visual processing disorder. This is the official-ish term that we're going to be looking at today. And this is how the brain processes visual information. It's not how the brain processes language. Two different things. A language disorder and a visual processing disorder, different. Having bad eyesight is completely different from a visual processing disorder. We've got a few things here that all sound like they overlap. When dyslexia was first a thing, people used to think it was because we had terrible eyesight. Completely wrong. This has happened time and time again throughout history. We thought we knew something, so we tried to treat it. But because we didn't truly understand it, we weren't getting the results we wanted. Sticking big glasses on someone with dyslexia isn't going to make them read better. And the same is true with visual processing. It's saying you could have 20/20 vision, right? Your eyes could be perfect. However, you still struggle to read because it's when the information goes through the eyes, that's fine. When it kind of converts and gets to the back of your brain and it's being processed here, it is at this point where the brain will have struggle processing. Dyslexia, on the other hand, the difficulty is a little bit later on when the brain is pulling apart the words. It received the information just fine, but now the brain is converting it to a format that it understands. You could say visual processing happens a little bit before the challenges you would normally associate with dyslexia. Now, here are some words to learn because, it's good to understand what we're talking about today. Visual discrimination is difficulty processing details. When people often say, I get my D's and my B's mixed up and my P's and my Q's, that is visual discrimination. It's things that look similar and the brain's just glossing over it. The brain is always trying to find the quickest answer to any problem, and sometimes it will miss details out. This could confuse words or objects. Dyslexia, for example, might be, you might say, a fork is a knife, because that is how you retrieve words. Visual dyslexia will be seeing it and confusing it that way. Visual memory, difficulty remembering people, poor reading comprehension. Doesn't this sound like dyspraxia? Yeah, it does sound like dyspraxia. It also sounds like ADHD. It also sounds like dyslexia. When we are talking about visual processing disorder, we're not actually talking about an official recognized condition that is in the DSM or the ICD, these official booklets that help us understand the brain. But it is more of a kind of umbrella term on terms of how different information is processed. This is why you could have ADHD and have visual processing disorder. You could have dyslexia. It's not one or the other. Quite often it's an overlapping challenge. We've got visual spatial relations, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, about a mile, those sorts of things. Sequential memory. This is remembering words and spellings. Those with dyslexia, often we talk about reading, but actually spelling comes from a different area. Quite often, you are either spelling words by remembering how they are formed through the linguistics. So you've got the phonologics like cat, or you might remember via the image. I've seen that word before, I recognize it. Those two things, they sound really similar, but actually they're quite different. If you are struggling with reading, try and ask yourself, what is it that you are struggling with? Is it visibly seeing the words? If so, it could be a visual problem. Is it seeing the words fine, but struggling to make sense of what you have seen? Or is it once you have broken the word down into little sections, being able to join them up? All three are different, and this is going to play a big part in your strategy for supporting yourself. We've got figure ground, difficulties locating objects in crowded environments. If you've ever played Where's Wally, you're going to be screwed. I'm the same with that. If I'll be like, where's my keys? And they'll be right in front of me, but I cannot see them. Then we've got visual closure, substituting one word for another. You might be talking and you'll just quickly use an alternative. This can also happen in reading a book. If you're reading a book and your friend's reading the same book at the same time, you might read it differently to how they're reading it because your brain is inserting differently. Then moto, integration, difficulties with writing. Now this again sounds very similar to a condition known as dysgraphia. Remember, we aren't talking about a brand new ND condition here. We are talking more about the way that the brain processes the information. This can definitely overlap across all of them. Now let's do a quick quiz. I just want to test your knowledge. All right, what is visual processing disorder, VPD? I've talked about it for a couple of minutes now. Let's see if we all understood. Is it difficulties in hearing and auditory processing? Is it difficulties in processing, interpreting visual information? Or is it difficulty in motor coordination? Yes, it is difficulty in processing and interpreting visual information, not being able to see it in order to be able to process it. Very important. Question 2 of 5. How does visual processing disorder relate to neurodiversity? It is not related to neurodiversity. It only affects individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders, or it is neurological differences that contribute to neurodiversity. Yes, you all got it right. It is a neurological difference that contributes. It isn't a ND condition. It isn't solely related to those who are neurodivergent. It does definitely cross over. 3 of 5. Which diagnostic clarification system includes visual processing disorder as a standalone disorder? Who's officially recognizing it? We've got the DSM-5, the ICD-11, or neither. It isn't in any of them, neither. You think, why, if it's not a real term, why are we learning about it? There's actually a lot of conditions which aren't officially recognized in the two big daddies of brain disorders, but are still very helpful ways of describing how you... Yeah, it's not officially recognized, but quite often it will be included as a description. Someone may say, I have a developmental disorder, a learning disability, a processing disorder, and then they may mention visual processing. Visual processing disorder shares overlapping symptoms with dysgraphia, dyslexia, or ADHD. What one does it share the most comorbidity with? It is, in fact, all of them. A lot of people with ADHD will also have visual processing disorders or challenges. A lot of people with dyslexia will have visual processing challenges. A lot of people with dysgraphia will also have visual processing difficulties. But you don't have to have them. Remember that. You can, but you don't have to. But you are more likely to. That is just a little bit of some insight into what it is. Now we can go more under the hood. How do you recognize if you even have one? First of all, visual processing disorder and learning disabilities are not the same. They often overlap, they aren't the same. In this image here, we've got all the disses, your dyslexias, your dyscalculias, your dysgraphias, and your praxias. These just mean difficulties. Dyslexia is difficulty in reading and language, where visual processing disorder is about how you visibly interpret the information. Doesn't have to relate to reading. Then you've got maths and concepts, which also can be a challenge. Fine motor skills, coordination. As you can see, all of these really heavily overlap, but these are learning disabilities or difficulties. Well, what we are talking about today is the processing side. It's difficulty interpreting visual information despite normal vision. Crucial. Don't let my glasses fool you. That's just a coincidence. It isn't just because you have glasses, you also have visual processing challenges. It is not dyslexia. It is not visual problems. It is not ADHD. Or sensory processing disorder is additional factors, maybe taste or sound, other ones like that. Its recognition is struggling with reading, and spatial awareness. As you can see, it overlaps with all of the classic NDs that we are familiar with. If you go to Churchill's website, they say it is visual processing disorder can cause issues with the way the brain processes visual information. There are many different types of processing disorders. So remember, umbrella term, not an individual condition, and many different symptoms, which can include the inability to detect different letters and shapes. I put this image here to help you understand how it is similar to dyslexia, but different. Officially, dyslexia is just dyslexia. There aren't subtypes of dyslexia, but often people will break it down into different types. And they do this in order to give you a better starting point to figure out what strategies may be more likely to support you. When we look at visual processing disorder, typically it is used interchangeably with visual dyslexia, hence the title of today. But they aren't the same thing. For one, visual dyslexia doesn't really exist because dyslexia isn't about the visual side of it. It's about the processing side of it. You may look at letters and think, oh, it's how you visibly process them, which is the challenge. No, it's how your brain interpreted the language. These old ones, they are useful, but do not take them too literal. Otherwise, you may get yourself into a bit of a pickle. Oh, Anna says, don't forget there is also DLD as a separate condition, developmental language disorder. Absolutely right, Anna. I don't actually talk about that much today, but we have done separate sessions on that. Just to go over a few of these subtypes, because while they're not really talking about what we are today, I do think they're quite interesting. Visual dyslexia is often what people think visual processing disorder is, and the name is a bit confusing because it's not actually related to dyslexia. Then we've got orthographic, which is when you could get your B's and your D's muddled up in particular. Phonologics, when it comes to pronunciation. This is our kind of OG dyslexia. When we think of dyslexia, we're basically talking about this one. Then we've got surface dyslexia, which is when you might struggle to see something and to be able to recall that information. Surface dyslexia is often a result from acquired dyslexia through a brain injury or a stroke or some sort of trauma. You will still get called dyslexic, even though this typically isn't neurodevelopmental. This is something that happens due to some life event. Directional, this is maybe struggling with your lefts and your rights. Rapid naming deficit, these are people who might struggle to be able to think really on the spot. Like, for instance, name a load of animals, tiger, cat, bear, but some people might struggle with that rapid recall. Then we've got double deficit, which essentially is having multiple of the two. Normally it's around phonologics and rapid naming deficits. As you can see, there's lots of ways of cutting up these difficulties. Whether or not they're official or not, I think is a bit irrelevant. It's more about whether or not you find it helpful and whether other people recognize it or understand it. Now let's move on to a little bit. Might you have a visual processing disorder? I'm not a doctor. I'm not here to diagnose you, but asking a few different questions may help you understand better whether or not it is dyslexia we are looking at, a visual impairment, or a processing disorder. We do this in order for you to create your own strategies rather than for you to say, I know exactly what's going on in my brain now. First question is, what style of lighting is most comfortable to you? Do you find it iridescent lighting, your kind of conventional light bulb in your house? What about fluorescent lightings, the ones that you'll typically get in an office? Do you find LEDs a bit nicer, or natural light? Natural light makes sense. Our eyes, our brains have adapted to learning to process that information. Our brain, think of it like a camera, like frames per second or frequencies. The more light it is emitting, the more the brain is able to pull that information. Things like fluorescence, they're a little bit jagged and it can cause headaches and distress. Those who struggle with visual processing will often struggle with flickering, and this can result in headaches. Yeah, we've got warm and specific locations, not bright or not too dark, fluorescence never. You're absolutely right, Rose. I'm always telling people not to use fluorescent lightings in workplaces. Due to visual processing issues, people with visual dyslexia may prefer specific types of lights. While warmer ambient lights may soothe some, softer diffused lighting may lessen glare and visual discomfort. Visual dyslexia sufferers may be more uncomfortable under intense or flickering illumination. Thus, lighting may greatly affect reading comfort. When we do audits for companies, we often say, we'll talk about the lighting, and people have no idea why lighting would be relevant. If the brain is already struggling to process information, the more barriers we put up, the more challenges that you have to overcome. If you're someone who struggles with reading, maybe you get headaches, but you think that your eyesight is actually fine, looking at the type of lighting you have actually could really make the difference. I normally suggest one that is a very warm color, one that is very bright, and one that has little to no flickering. LEDs tend to be maybe better for this because of the way that they are made. Visual processing disorder can affect many different areas. Just like dyslexia, it can affect reading. Just like dysgraphia, it can affect writing. Just like dyscalculia, it can affect mathematics. It can also affect perception, memory, attention, organization, just like ADHD can affect motor coordination, like dysgraphia. If you're like, nah, I don't even know what all these terms are. They are all neurodevelopmental disorders or things that are part of you throughout your life, though they do all overlap. This is quite an interesting diagram, I think, as it nicely describes the difference between what it is and what it isn't. You can get certain letter combinations misread. That is definitely visual processing. But dyslexia is trouble with rhyming and splitting words. One is more focused on language and one is more focused on the visual processing. Really key to remember that. Oh, Laura says, I appreciate it will be different between individuals, but are there other things other than lighting that you'd suggest people or trainers can do to support colleagues who have visual processing disorders? Yeah, it really would depend. Visual processing disorder doesn't go away on its own. The first thing you should do is check your vision. Not that it is related to your eyesight, but it's definitely a good thing to rule out of the way first. Then the second thing is to try to minimize glare, making sure that the lights aren't too glary. You might want to have glasses have slight tints in them. You might want to do fonts which are very easy to read, as less likely that the brain is going to get confused. Essentially, you've got to look at your journey from A to Z, and every step along the way, what are things you can do to minimize the potential place for the brain to trip up or get confused? See glare from bright items while others don't. Some people might call this haloing. A lot of people who might have had, for instance, laser eye surgery experience haloing. If you've had laser eye surgery, this might skew the results a little bit. And this is when the colors bleed together, where you're unable to differentiate like one color from the other and they merge. But before this to really count, you do have to rule out vision problems first. This is why you'd never get diagnosed with. This is more just to help you understand. Different wavelengths can be easier for the brain to process than others. It's why some people might be colorblind. This is why people use colored overlays, because what it does is it's blocking certain wavelengths. If you use a blue color tint, that will be blocking that wavelength, which might make it a bit easier to digest what's in front of you. All right, next one. If you suffer from any of the following, visual processing disorders might be a problem. Print differs. Maybe the way you're like looking at print or newspapers, things blur together despite the print actually being completely clear. You might have differences in environments, poor reading speeds, poor comprehension, eye strain, fatigue, headaches, hard to copy. You can probably think this is why it gets a little bit challenging because there's so many overlaps. This is why you really do need to go to a professional. There are some things here which aren't related to dyslexia per se, such as those with dyslexia shouldn't really get headaches or trouble with certain things. The visual sides of dyslexia shouldn't really be a problem more often than not. And this is when you might be a bit more inclined to look down the visual processing rather than the language comprehension. So any of you have glasses? What about contacts, sunglasses? None of these. This is just to really hit home the fact, if you have glasses, that is where your eyes aren't strong enough. Essentially, your eyes like to focus, right? You've got muscles in your eyes and they stretch, they contrast, and that allows you to see the world. If you've got a problem there, go to your opticians. If, however, your vision is fine, but how you interpret the information around you, you're not really picking up on what is actually there, that could be a visual processing disorder. However, if that is fine, and then it gets to, all right, I've got the information, now I've got to decode it, that is dyslexia. Be mindful, they are different, but first port of call is always to make sure your eyes are happy and healthy. If you do have a visual processing disorder, glasses aren't going to help. Contacts aren't going to help. Sunglasses with particular tints, again, that is because it is limiting certain UV rays and certain color spectrums, which can make it easier. While you will look like an absolute cool dude in your house, it actually could help. April says, I wear glasses when I use my computer to stop my eyes from getting too tired, and I also use them when I go to the cinema. That is another thing I could actually recommend to a lot of you. Your computer screen also emits light in different ways. When we talk about the refresh rate in terms of how quick the screen is refreshing, you will not notice it, but trust me, your brain will. You may want to look into getting a computer with higher refresh rate. That is a reasonable adjustment we sometimes recommend people we support, and it's something that has greatly helped me as well. You do not want an old dusty monitor. It will give you headaches. What about wearing blue light glasses? That's the thing, Blake. Blue light glasses are a different reason. I know there's so many reasons. For those of you who do not know, when we use like LEDs, they emit this kind of like blue light. And this blue light tricks our brain into thinking it's daytime and stay super awake and vigilant. Over time, that can cause strain and fatigue. Blue light and visual processing disorder aren't the same thing. Blue glasses could help you, but equally, yellow glasses could help you. The wavelength of color really depends per person. If you are struggling to process visual information, it's going to give you a headache. It's as simple as the brain is having to work overtime. Just like if you've got poor vision, your eye muscles are working overtime in order to correct, can give you headaches. The same is true, which if you're processing headaches. And I guess you could say even with dyslexia, you could get headaches. Headaches is a bit of a minefield, and able to pinpoint exactly where the discomfort is coming from is really difficult. Oh, a little cute picture of Psyduck. All right, so on here, I want you to sort out things that give you a headaches. If you think TVs are more likely to give you headaches, rate it at the top, reading, and understanding which things are more likely to give you a headache may point you in maybe the more right direction on the type of support that you may be looking for. Supermarket lighting is notoriously terrible because they use luminescence. They're using those big long light bulbs that flicker all the time. That is very distressing. And that is a classic sign of a slight visual processing difficulty. Computers, again, often due to the refresh rate. TVs are normally much better at refresh rates because they've got motion that's happening all the time. TVs tend to be better quality than monitors. That's why if you've ever tried to watch like a movie on your computer screen, quite often it doesn't look quite as good. Reading would typically be related to dyslexia because if we're looking at like print, paper and print, that isn't changing at all. This will be the easiest for those with a visual processing disorder and the most difficult for those with dyslexia. Next one, do any of these affect you? These are the result of having a visual processing disorder. Now, again, a lot of these are associated with, say, things like dyspraxia, but it can also affect other areas. Clumsiness, maybe bumping into things, being a little bit accident prone. And this is your brain might not be visibly able to process fast enough in order for that information to be relevant. Let's say someone chucks a ball at you, you can visibly see it, but if your brain hasn't connected the dots to think, okay, this is coming nearer to me and I need to catch it in time. This is why some of us, unfortunately, are a little bit terrible at sports. It's just about the processing speed, not the visual side of things. Again, this doesn't relate to dyslexia. This is like more dyspraxia kind of realm, but you don't have to have dyspraxia in order to be clumsy, accident prone, bump into things, or be bad at sports. Simply seeing a professional. Go to your opticians. They'll be able to sort it out first. Then, if your eyes are fine, that's when you might want to seek a professional for a visual processing disorder. You can get an assessment for Irlen syndrome, which is about the visual glare. I would say to those who question whether or not a diagnosis is real, if the support strategies benefit you, that's the most important thing. Some people find that tinted glasses really help them. Other people think it has no impact whatsoever. Whether or not it's a placebo effect or there's real science behind it, ultimately it's about whether or not something benefits you. Good question. Next question is, skip words or lose your position when reading. Is this something that you rarely do or something that you always do? This definitely overlaps with processing disorder and dyslexia. The reason why they overlap is quite different. Dyslexia might be that your brain is trying to process the phonologics and the patterns in between, and as it's processing, it can get confused and mixed up. Where visual processing is when it visibly looks at it and it's unable to fix on it. I sometimes see it like the eyes, the brain will anchor on a word and allow you to move forward. But if your anchor isn't really there or non-existent, your brain will struggle to focus exactly on the word that you're reading. You might read the same word again and again, even though you're comprehending it completely fine. You're just not able to move forward in the discussion. Yeah, pegs are like all of them. Next one, we talked about discrimination, the visual type. This is about the brain seeing it, not being able to point out the differences. It's not your brain isn't taking in all the information that is available. A classic example is with spot the difference. On this one, you can actually put a little pin on where you think the difference is. This isn't a difficulty with dyslexia, but is a difficulty with visual processing. This could be that, again, when we're talking about like your keys or maybe around the house, you're the type of person where it is completely obvious to anyone else around you that your thing is right there and they tell you that you haven't even looked for it, but you just cannot see it. I am so guilty for this. If something is just slightly hidden, let me try an example. I don't know, this little box, right? Say there's a picture frame just slightly in front of it. My brain will not recognize it. It will say it simply isn't here. Rather than being able to take a little bit of information and fill in the gaps, I need to make it really obvious for my brain to pick up on the differences. I don't know if that's a difference. Let's have a look if any of you are right. I'd say, yeah, that hat's a different color. Or the nose, yep, that's a good one. I could imagine some of you found that really difficult because the brain it's irrelevant. It doesn't see the purpose of being able to spot these differences. It might be putting more cognitive effort into maybe you were all trying to look at the shapes rather than actually looking at the colors. Next one is the classic thing that people say is dyslexia, is confusing letters and numbers. Typically, actually, they say it's like B's and D's, but visual processing can also be letters and numbers. Which of these do you often get confused? Do you get your G's and Q's mixed up? Your I's and ones? This isn't because you struggle to read, say, one and I. That would be dyslexia. Visual processing is because they look similar, your brain struggles to differentiate between how they both visibly look. G and 6, again, you know the difference between them, but because they look similar, the brain just confuses it. On the other hand, though, there are benefits, like when you're looking at car number plates and you can have a giggle because something looks similar enough that you're able to make up your own words out of it. This goes back to the whole point where the brain tries to be really efficient and tries to process as quick as it possibly can do. And by doing that, sometimes it trips up over itself. Some of you mentioned about meditation can help ground you. That makes a lot of sense because when the brain just needs time to slow down, it's essentially learning to walk before you can run. When you run for too long, walking again can make it a lot easier. Oh, Lauren says, are there ways when displaying charts and graphs which can help people with visual processing disorders? Yes, absolutely. With colours, you want to make sure that they're quite distinct from each other. They do not all blur into each other. Using accessibility guidelines can really help. Using a sans serif font, I know, Arial, for instance, is really good because there aren't any taily bits or curly bits which can distract the letters. You may also want to change the background colour. So here I've used a slightly off-white rather than pure white because that means the contrast would be very jarring. The biggest key thing here is any difference, any adjustment you make should either benefit everyone or not disadvantage anyone. Because I had a question last week, which was, if we make something very appealing for someone, say with dyslexia, having low contrast, would that make it more difficult for someone with visual impairment? And the answer is, yeah, it would make it more difficult. You need to find that sweet middle ground, which I appreciate, easier said than done. All right, on this one, I want you to all have a read it. If you can read it, little digital thumbs up. If you can't read it, tough luck. Here you can see that it's a little bit blurry, right? If it was a little bit blurry, could be one or two things. One, you need some glasses. Or two, it's that your brain is smudging them together. One way that you could do to support someone who might have a visual processing disorder is making sure that the space between each character is wide enough the brain sees every individual letter as its own character rather than blurring things together. Visual processing is characterized by difficulties understanding written symbols, including the symbols used to represent language, numbers. You can read it. This is an example of what it can be like. Here is another example. This is where you might see a little bit of overlap between visual processing and Irlen syndrome. There is a lot of similarities, but the key thing here is Irlen syndrome is a little bit debated and can be rectified by using tinted glasses, where visual processing disorder can't be rectified on its own. And having tinted glasses probably isn't going to help that much. This isn't showing you what it's like for everyone, but it's showing you what it can be like for some people. Take it with a grain of salt. Let's get to the good stuff. Yeah, here we are. You could find going text blurry, but maybe it'll go blurry, sharp, blurry, sharp. This is one way it can demonstrate. Another way is you might find that certain words are floating or pulsating almost. This is one that I particularly find quite often. Then you've got the halo one, where the sharpness tends to dissolve and being able to say what one character is to the next character can be more challenging. Then you've got the ripple effect. This is, again, one that I've definitely experienced when reading. We've always got to appreciate that while we are talking about visual processing, know that it can affect people in many different ways. Trying to find things that universally help, such as a clear font, making sure that there's enough space in between letters. What other ones we've also got a seesaw, we've got a little bit shaky, or swirly, or that's a little bit extreme. The point here is that how someone's brain interprets it can vary quite dramatically. It really isn't a one-size-fits-all. Just so you all know, if you were to go to your optometrist, they would be a good person to see to be able to rule it out and to signpost you in the right direction. Visual processing is a very specialist field. A lot of people do end up going private for those areas, particularly because if you do think that you may have Irlen syndrome, for example, it isn't officially recognized. Yeah, you do have to find ones that are particularly trained in it. So it's always worth asking them, do they have experience in visual processing disorders and difficulties? They're really not all created equal. For instance, if you go to an optician, some of them will have training in that area, where a lot of them would not have training. If you suspect that it may be more related to processing than your visual ability, it's definitely worthwhile checking that they've got that experience. Okay, on this one, nice and simple, which ones do you relate to? Do you find that you often blink or squint, use fingers as other markers? Because when you're reading, are you doing that? Get restless, energetic, or fidgety when reading? If the brain is overly struggling, it will find another way to distract its attentions. Do you get restless, active, or fidgety? These are just some of the ways it may present. Oh, we've got another quiz question that came out of nowhere. How many black dots are there? I want you to all have a look at this, and then you put down how many black dots. Okay, the correct answer was 0. The reason you thought you saw black dots was because of the contrast of white and black. The eyes, there's an optical illusion and they distort, and it creates like what we call a bleed. And there aren't any dots. Imagine if you struggle with visual processing and you're reading something and that is happening, like you saw fake dots that weren't really there. Someone may see letters or characters that aren't really there, which can slow the reading process down. There's so many different examples where you can see how just how different colors and tones change and they can flicker. This is what it can be like with artificial lighting. Another thing that people may often struggle with is symmetry as well. If you look on here, are you able to see what they all have in common? Quick answer, it is T, because T can be only divided once, where the others can have multiple forms of symmetry, those areas. Some other characteristics. Computer and strain is a classic one. Trouble reading music, might be maths areas, misaligned numbers. If you're someone who thinks, you know what, I don't have dyslexia, I've been tested for it, but I still struggle with these areas, what else could it be? Maybe this is an area you might want to look a little bit further down the rabbit hole. Some top tips is to simplify and reduce distractions. If you've got a lot of junk around you, get rid of it. The more visual information your brain is having to process, the more likely it's going to be overwhelmed. Use colored and textured paper, which can make things a little bit more tactile and 3D. You might want to use apps that can change the color of the screen, or get computers that have a higher refresh rate. You might want to try audiobooks. What I like to do is I have a physical book and I have an audiobook playing at the same time. I'm following along while hearing it. When my brain does glitch out a little bit, I'm still able to keep track. You might use text-to-speech software, gain colored tints. There are lots of things you can do that can help minimize it, but it isn't something that necessarily goes away. A quick summary, just so we're all crystal clear and you go away knowing exactly what the difference is. A visual processing disorder is trouble processing visual information, and it affects various tasks. Very broad. Then we've got dyslexia, which is about reading and writing difficulties due to language processing. Key thing here, dyslexia is due to language processing. The first one is due to visual processing. Irlen syndrome, while it overlaps very heavily with visual processing disorder, this is very much talking about the strain, and it can be rectified via colors, whereas dyslexia and visual processing can't be rectified by color tints, though they can make it a little bit more soothing. These are the key things that ultimately I wanted to make sure everyone went away with today. If you did find today useful and you wanted to catch up on our previous webinars, do check out our ones we've got on our YouTube channel. You also would be eligible for a workplace needs assessment. If any of you are like, you know what, Nat, what you said sounds exactly like me. However, I do not have a diagnosis, you would still be eligible for support. Via an Access to Work grant, which we have in the UK, you can actually ask for monitors that have faster refresh rates. You can ask for computer softwares that allow your screen to change color or to change the contrast. You can also get certain glasses under certain circumstances. There is support available, which will allow you to remain in the workplace. This is only available to people in the UK, and it's only available to those who are in work. But if that does relate to you, do get in contact with us, because a lot of the things I mentioned aren't cheap, and this can definitely get rid of some of that burden. Our next webinar is ADHD in women, and we're particularly focusing on ADHD without the hyperactive tendency, because it tends to have a higher prevalence in women. It's often why a lot of women go underdiagnosed with ADHD, so definitely check this out. Here's our YouTube channel. If you do want to get in contact, just go to exceptionalindividuals.com. drop us an email and we'll be more than happy to get back to you and see how we may be able to support or work together. All right, we are done, guys. Hope you found that useful. A little bit of a minefield, but genuinely, it's useful to understand why your brain is struggling in order to find the best solutions. A lot of things we did today was to create empathy for those who do not understand what it's like. Yeah, have a rest, relax. Off you pop, everyone. Go and enjoy your day.